What's up, guys? This is day 2 of reading The Big Short until I finish this book. So let's continue. Even on Wall Street, people think he's rude and obnoxious and aggressive. Say Eastman's wife, Valerie Fagan, who worked at JP Morgan before quitting to open the women's clothing store in New York, and to raise their children. He has no interest in manners. Believe me, I've tried and I've tried and I've tried. After she has brought him home for the first time, her mother had said, "Well, we can use him, but we can definitely auction him off at UJA." Esmond had what amount to a talent for offering people. He's not particularly rude, his wife explained. He's sincerely rude. He knows everyone thinks of him as a character, but he doesn't think of himself that way. Stephen lives inside his head. When asked about the pattern of upsets he leaves in his wake, Isman simply looked puzzled, even a bit wounded. "I forgot myself sometime," he said with a shrug. Here was the first of many theories about Isman. He was simply so much more interested in whatever was rattling around his brain than he was in whoever happened to be standing in front of him, that the one overwhelming the other. This theory struck others who knew Isman well as incomplete. His mother, Lillian, offered a second theory. "Stephen actually has two personalities," she said carefully. One was that of a boy to whom she had given the brand new bicycle he so desperately craved, only to help him pedal it into Central Park, lend it to a kid he had never met, and watch it vanish into the distance. The other was that of the young man who set out to study the Talmud, not because he had the slightest interest in God, but because he was curious about its internal contradictions. His mother had been appointed chairman of the Board of Jewish Education in New York City, and Isman was combining the Talmud for inconsistencies. "Who else studies Talmud so that they can find the mistakes?" asked his mother. Later, after Isman became seriously rich and had to think about how to give money away, he landed on an organization called Footsteps, devoted to helping Hasidic Jews flee their religion. He couldn't even give away his money without picking a fight. By pretty much every account, Isman was a curious character, and he walked onto Wall Street at the very beginning of a curious phase, the creation of the mortgage bond market. A decade earlier had extended Wall Street into a place it had never before been, the depths of ordinary Americans. At first, the new bond market machine concerned itself with the more solvent half of the American population. Now, with the extension of the mortgage bond market into the affair of less creditworthy Americans, it found its fuel in the depths of the less solvent half. The mortgage bond was different in important ways from old-fashioned corporate and government bonds. The mortgage bond wasn't a single giant loan for an explicit fixed term. A mortgage bond was a claim on the cash flow from a pool of thousands of individual home mortgages. These cash flows were always problematic, as the borrowers had the right to pay off any time they pleased. This was the single biggest reason that bond investors initially had been reluctant to invest in home mortgage loans. Mortgage borrowers typically repaid their loan only when interest rates fell and they could refinance more cheaply, leaving the owner of a mortgage bond holding a pile of cash to invest at lower interest rate. The investor in home loan didn't know how long his investment would last, only that he would get his money back when he least wanted. To limit this uncertainty, the people I worked with at Salomon, who created the mortgage bond market, had come up with a clever solution. They took giant pools of home loan and carved up the payments made by homeowners into pieces called tranches. The buyer of the first tranche was like the owner of the ground floor in a flat. He got hit with the first wave of mortgage prepayment. In exchange, he received a higher interest rate. The buyer of the second tranche, the second story of the skyscraper, took the next wave of prepayment and in exchange received the second highest interest rate, and so on. The investor in the top floor of the building received the lowest rate of interest but had the greatest assurance that his investment wouldn't end before he wanted it to. The big fear of the 1980s mortgage bond investor was that he would be repaid too quickly, not that he would fail to be repaid at all. The pool of loan underlying the mortgage bond conformed to the standard in the size and the credit quality of the borrower set by one of several government agencies, Freddie Mac, Fannie Mac, and Ginnie Mac. The loan carried in effect government guarantees. If the homeowner defaulted, the government paid off their debts. When Stephen Eastman stumbled into this new rapidly growing industry of specialty finance, the mortgage bond was about to be put to new use, making loans that did not qualify for government guarantee. The purpose was to extend credit to less and less creditworthy homeowners, not so that they might buy a house, but so that they could cash out whatever equity they had in the house they already owned. The mortgage bond created from subprime home loan extended the logic invented to address the problem of early prepayment to cope with the problem of no repayment at all. The investor in the first floor or tranche would be exposed not to prepayment but to actual losses. He took the first losses until his investment was entirely wiped out, whereupon the losses hit the guy on the second floor and so on. In the early 1990s, just a pair of Wall Street analysts devoted their career to understanding the effects of extending credit into places where that sun didn't often shine. Steve Eastman was one. The other was Cy Jacobs. Jacobs had gone through the same Salomon Brothers training program that I had and now worked for a small investment bank called Alex Brown. I said through the Salomon training program and got to hear what this great new securitization model Louis Ranieri was creating was going to do. He recalled, Ranieri was the closest thing the mortgage bond market had to a founding father. The implication of turning home mortgage into bond were mind-bogglingly vast. One man's liability had always been another man's asset. But now, more and more of the liabilities could be turned into bits of paper that you could sell to anyone. In short order, the Salomon Brothers trading floor gave birth to a small market in bond funded by all sorts of strange stuff: credit card receivables, aircraft lease, auto loans, health club dues. To invent a new market was only a matter of finding a new asset to hook. The most obvious untapped asset in America was still the home. People with first mortgage had vast amount of equity locked up in their houses. Why shouldn't this untapped equity too be securitized? The thinking in subprime, said Jacob, was there was the social stigma to being a second mortgage borrower, and there really shouldn't be. If your credit rating was a little worse, you paid a lot more, and a lot more than you really should. If we can mass market the bond, we can drive down the cost of borrowers. The cost to borrowers. They can replace high interest rate credit card debts with lower interest rate mortgage debt, and it will become a self-fulfilling prophecy. The growing interface between high finance and lower middle class America was assumed to be good for lower middle class America. This new efficiency in the capital markets would allow lower middle class Americans to pay lower and lower interest rates on their debts. In the early 1990s, the first subprime mortgage lenders, the money store Greentree MS, sold share to the public so that they might grow faster. By the mid 1990s, thousands of small consumer lending companies were coming to market each year. The subprime lending industry was fragmented because the lenders sold many, though not all, of the loans they made to other investors in the form of mortgage bond. The industry was also fraught with moral hazard. It was a fast buck business, said Jacobs. Any business where you can sell a product and make money without having to worry how the product performs is going to attract salesy people. That was the seamy underbelly of the good idea. Eastman and I both believe in the big idea, and we both met some really salesy characters. That was our job, to figure out which of the characters were the right ones to pull off the big idea. Subprime mortgage lending was still a trivial fraction of the US credit market, a few tens of billions of loans each year, but it exists, but its existence makes sense, even to Steve Eastman. I thought it was partly a response to growing income inequality. He said, the distribution of income in this country was skewed and becoming more skewed, and the result was that you have more subprime customer. Of course, Eastman was paid to see the scene in subprime lending. Oppenheimer quickly became one of the lending bankers in the new industry, in no small part because Eastman was one of its lending proponents. I took a lot of subprime company public, said Eastman, and the story they like to tell was that we are helping the consumer because we are taking him out of his high interest rate credit card debt and putting him into lower interest rate mortgage debt. And I believe that story. Then something changed. Vincent Daniel had grown up in Queens without any of the perks Steve Eastman took for granted, and yet if you met them, you might guess that it was Winnie, who had grown up in high style on Park Avenue, and Eastman, who had been raised in the small duplex on 82nd Avenue. Eastman was brazen and grandiose and focused on the big kill. Winnie was careful and wary and interested in details. He was young and fit, with thick, dark hair and handsome features, but his appearance was overshadowed by his concerned expression, mouth ever poised to frown, eyebrow ever ready to rise. He had little to lose, but still seemed perpetually worried that something important was about to be taken from him. His father had been murdered when he was a small boy, though no one ever talked about that, and his mother had found a job as a bookkeeper at a commodities trading firm. She had raised Winnie and his brother alone. Maybe it was Queens, maybe it was what had happened to his father, or maybe it was just the way Vincent Daniel was fired, but he viewed his fellow men with the most intense suspicion. It was with the out of a champion, speaking of an even greater champion, that Steve Eastman said, "One is dark." Eastman was an upper middle class kid who had been faintly surprised when he wound up at Penn instead of Yale. Wani was a lower middle class kid whose mother was proud of him for getting into any college at all, and prouder still when, in 1994, after Winnie graduated from SUNY Binghamton, he had gotten himself hired in Manhattan by Arthur Andersen, the accounting firm that would be destroyed a few years later in the Enron scandal. Growing up in Queens, you very quickly figure out where the money is, said Vinny. It's in Manhattan. His first assignment in Manhattan as a junior accountant was to audit Salomon Brothers. He was instantly struck by the opacity of an investment bank's book. None of his fellow accountants was able to explain why the traders were doing what they were doing. I didn't know what I was doing, said Winnie. But the scary thing was, my manager didn't know anything either. I asked these basic questions like, why do they own this mortgage bond? Are they just betting on it, or is it part of some larger strategy? I thought I needed to know. It's really difficult to audit a company if you cannot connect the dots. He concluded that there was effectively no way for an accountant assigned to audit a giant Wall Street firm to figure out whether it was making money or losing money. There were giant black boxes whose hidden gears were in constant motion. Several months into the audit, when his manager grew tired of his question, he couldn't explain it to me. He said, Wendy, it's not your job. I hired you to do XYZ. Do XYZ and shut your mouth. I walked out of his office and said, I gotta get out of here. Wendy went looking for another job. An old school friend of his worked at a place called Oppenheimer & Co. and was making good money. He handed Wendy's resume into human resource and it made its way to Steve Eastman, who turned out to be looking for someone to help him pass the increasingly arcane accounting used by subprime mortgage originators. I can add, said Eastman. I think in story. I need help with numbers. When he heard that Eastman could be difficult and was surprised that when they met, Eastman seemed interested only in whether they'd be able to get along. He seemed to be just looking for a good egg, said Winnie. They met twice when Eastman phoned him out of the blue. Winnie assumed he was about to be offered a job, but soon after they start to talk, Eastman received an emergency call on the other line and put Winnie on hold. Winnie sat waiting for 15 minutes in silence, but Eastman never came back on the line. 2 months later, Eastman called him back. When could Winnie start? Eastman didn't particularly recall why he had put Winnie on hold and never picked up again, any more than he recalled why he had gone to the bathroom in the middle of lunch with a big-time CEO and never returned. Winnie soon found his own explanation. When he had picked up the other line, Eastman had been informed that his first child, a newborn son named Max, had died. Valerie, sick with the flu, had been awakened by a night nurse who informed her that she, the night nurse, had rolled on top of the baby in her sleep and smothered him. What the fuck? Smothered him. A decade later, the people closest to Eastman would describe this as an event that changed his relationship to the world around him. Stephen always thought he had an angel on his shoulder, said Valerie. said Valerie. Nothing bad ever happened to Stephen. He was protected and he was safe. After Max, the angel on his shoulder was done. Anything can happen to anyone at any time. From that moment, she noticed many changes in her husband, large and small, and Eastman did not disagree. From the point of view of the history of the universe, Mike's death was not a big deal, said Eastman. It was just my big deal. At any rate, Winnie and Eastman never talked about what had happened. All Winnie knew was that the Eastman he went to work for was obviously not quite the same Eastman he had met several months earlier. The Eastman Winnie had interviewed with was, by the standard of Wall Street analysts, honest. He was not completely uncooperative. Oppenheimer was among the leading bankers to the subprime mortgage industry. They never would have been given the banking business if Eastman, their noisiest analyst, had not been willing to say nice things about them. Much as he enjoyed bashing and less viable companies, bashing the less viable companies, he accepted that the subprime lending industry was useful addition to the US economy. His willingness to be rude about a few of these subprime originators was, in a way, useful. It lent credibility to his recommendation of the others. Eastman was now about to become notably more negatively disposed in ways that, from the point of view of his employers, were financially counterproductive. It was like he had smelled something, said Winnie. He needed my help figuring out what it was he had smelled. Eastman wanted to write a report that more or less demanded the entire industry, but he needed to be more careful than usual. You can be positive and wrong on the sell side, said Winnie, but if you are negative and wrong, you get fired. Ammunition to cause trouble had just arrived a few months earlier from Moody's. The rating agency now possessed and offered for sales all sorts of new information about subprime mortgage loan. What the Moody's database did not allow you to examine individual loans, it offered a general picture of the pool of loan underlying individual mortgage bonds. How many were flooding rate, how many of the house borrowed against were owner occupied. Most importantly, how many were delinquent. Here's this database, Eastman said simply. Go into that room, don't come out until you figure out what it means. Winnie had the feeling Eastman already knew what it meant. Winnie was otherwise on his own. I'm 26 years old, he says, and I haven't really understood what mortgage-backed securities really are. Eastman didn't know anything about them either. He was a stock market guy, and Oppenheimer didn't even have a bond department. Winnie had to teach himself. When he was done, he had an explanation for the unpleasant odor wafting from the subprime mortgage industry that Eastman had detected. These companies disclosed their ever-growing earnings, but not much else. One of the many items they failed to disclose was the delinquency rate of the home loans they were making. When Eastman had bugged them for this, they would pretend that the fact was irrelevant, as they had sold all the loans off to people who backed them into mortgage bonds. The risk was no longer theirs. This was untrue. All retained some small fraction of the loan they originated, and the companies were allowed to book as profit the expected future value of those loans. The accounting rule allowed them to assume the loan would be repaid and not prematurely. This assumption became the engine of their doom. When first caught, Winnie's eye were the high prepayments coming in from a sector called manufactured housing. It sounds better than mobile homes. Mobile homes were different from the wheel-less kind. Their value dropped like cars the moment they left the store. The mobile home buyer, unlike the ordinary home buyer, couldn't expect it to refinance in 2 years and take money out. Why were they prepaying so fast? When he asked himself. It made no sense to me. Then I saw that the reason the prepayment were so high is that they were involuntary. Involuntary prepayment sounds better than default. Mobile home buyers were defaulting on their homes. Their mobile homes were being repossessed, and the people who had lent them money were receiving fraction of the original loan. Eventually, I saw that all the prime sector were either being prepaid or going bad at an incredible rate, said Winnie. I was just seeing stunningly high delinquency rate in this pool. The interest rate on the loan wasn't high enough to justify the risk of lending to this particular slice of American population. It was as if the ordinary rule of finance had been suspended in response to a social problem. A, a one crossed his mind. A thought crossed his mind. How do you make poor people feel wealthy when wages are stagnant? You give them cheap loans. To stiff every pool of subprime mortgage loan took him 6 months, but when he was done, he came out of the room and gave Isman the news. All these subprime lending companies were growing so rapidly and using such goofy accounting that they could mask the fact that they had no real earning, just illusory, accounting-driven ones, that they had the essential feature of Ponzi scheme to maintain the fiction that they were profitable enterprise. They needed more and more capital to create more and more subprime loans. I wasn't actually 100% sure I was right, said Winnie, but I go to Steve and say, this really doesn't look good. That was all he needed to know. I think what he needed was evidence to downgrade the stock. The report Isman wrote trashed all of the subprime originators. One by one, he exposed the deception of dozen companies. Here is the difference, he said, between the view of the world they are presenting to you and the actual numbers. The subprime company did not appreciate his effort. He created a shitstorm, said Vinny. All these subprime companies were calling and hollering at him. You are wrong. Your data are wrong. And he just hollered back at them. It's your fucking data. One of the reasons Isman's report distributed so many is that he had failed to give the companies he had insulted fair warning. He had violated the Wall Street Code. Steve knew this was going to create a shitstorm, said Vinny, and he wanted to create a shitstorm, and he didn't want to be talked out of it. And if he told them, he would have had all these people trying to talk him out of it. We were never able to evaluate the loan before we never had the data, said Isman later. My name was wet to this industry. My entire reputation had been built on covering these stocks. If I was wrong, that would be the end of the career of Steve Isman. Isman published his report in September 1997, in the middle of what happened to be one of the greatest economic boom in U.S. U.S. history. Less than a year later, Russia defaulted and a hedge fund called Long-Term Capital Management went bankrupt. In the subsequent flight to safety, the early submariner were denied capital and promptly went bankrupt en masse. Their failure was interpreted as an indictment of their accounting practices, which allowed them to record profit before they were realized. No one but Vinny, so far as Vinny could tell, ever really understood the crappiness of the loan they had made. It made me feel good that there was such inefficiency to this market, he said, because if the market catches on to everything, I probably have the wrong job. You can add anything by looking at this arcane stuff. So why bother? But I was the only guy I knew who was covering companies that were all going to go bust during the greatest economic bomb we'll ever see in my lifetime. I saw how the sausage was made in the economy, and it was really freaky. Yeah, that was 30 minutes of today Big Short, and I will see you guys tomorrow. Bye. Like and subscribe.